Hello and welcome to this short lecture on psychological literacy. My name's Julie Hume and I'm Professor of Psychology Education here at NTU Psychology, and you can see my email address there on the slide. So today I'm going to hopefully help you to meet 3 learning outcomes. I'm hoping by the end of all this, and possibly after a little bit of reading, and I've put a link to some extra reading up on the Now room as well, that you'll be able to appreciate what it is you get out of studying psychology, the knowledge, the skills and the attributes that you acquire through studying a psychology degree. That you'll understand and be able to explain the concepts of psychological literacy and psychologically literate citizenship, terms which might not be familiar to you yet, but hopefully will be by the end of this lecture, and be able to think about how you can apply psychology to solve problems in your everyday life. So I want you to just take a few seconds to think about, why did you choose to study psychology? What was exciting about psychology? What attracted you to it? And this has been something that's been studied previously by Rachel Bromnick and Ava Horowitz from the University of Lincoln. And they found that most psychology students didn't really want to be super rich. They wanted to be comfortable financially. They didn't want to be super famous or really prestigious. But what they really wanted was to make a difference to the people around them and in people's lives. Is that you? If so, then hopefully today we're going to think about some of the ways in which psychology equips you to make a difference to other people and to your own life. So as you're reflecting on this, think about what it is that you get from studying psychology. What does it give you? How does being a psychology third year student, almost graduate, make you special? What are the unique selling points that you and other psychology graduates might be able to offer to an employer or to a community organisation, someone who is trying to bring about change in a local community, for example. So that sort of brings us to this idea of, well, what is psychology? What does it actually do? What's it all about? And hopefully by now you've got a good idea, but I bet probably if I said to you, what is psychology? You might give a very generic definition, like it's the study of mind, brain and behaviour. Or you might talk about social psychology and cognitive psychology and all the different sub-areas of psychology, the sub-disciplines of psychology. And this is a quote from a paper that I published with a colleague, Helen Kitching, back in 2017. And I think it gives us a slightly different perspective, perhaps, on what psychology is all about. Psychology is an unusual discipline, drawing on natural sciences, social sciences, and philosophy. It encompasses all aspects of what it is to be human, covering biology and neuropsychology, social interaction and cultural context, cognitive processing, development from pre-birth to death, all of the things that humans share in common, and all of the ways in which we are diverse. As such, it touches on the life experiences of each and every one of us, and at the same time requires us to study those experiences within an academic context. This is really unusual. We're asking you to think scientifically about human beings, human experiences. We're asking you to be able to detach yourself and look at the condition of being human in a way that at the same time is particularly challenging, because you are living that. You have an emotional reaction to it. You can't fully detach and be completely objective when you're thinking about studying psychology. And we're asking you to be scientific, or at least most of the time, to be scientific about the psychology that you're studying. So most of psychology draws on what's known as the hypothetico-deductive model of science. This means that we observe something in the world around us. We might observe something about human nature, for example. So perhaps we've noticed that when in groups, individuals tend to conform to group norms. This leads us to make predictions. So we develop a theory based on our observations about that kind of human behaviour that we've seen. So we might think that maybe humans tend to identify with the groups that they belong to, social identity theory, for example, and that this is what leads them to conform. We now need to test that theory. Is that true? Do humans actually have this sense of group identity? Do they define themselves according to the groups that they belong to? And do they conform to those groups? And so we undertake research. The research generates data. So we carry out a study and that generates data which we analyse. If what we find in our study confirms the theory, supports what we expected, not just the hypothesis, but the larger theory, for example, social identity theory, then we can accept that that theory is possibly true and carry on observing and predicting and researching. If we find that our hypotheses are not upheld, then we might need to review that theory, rewrite it, think about it again, and then begin again. And so psychology generally works along these empirical ways of thinking, that we make predictions about the world around us based on theory, we carry out research, and then we either uphold that theory or we say we've disproven the theory and we start again, or we refine it. So you might expect then that one of the things that a psychology student can do is to think scientifically about what it is to be human. And people started to ask this question of what can psychology students do? What is psychology all about? What does it mean to have a psychology degree? Back in 1990, a psychologist called Bonneau, a French psychologist, started to wonder, what does having a psychology degree mean? And so he contacted a number of authors of psychology textbooks and got them to generate a list of terms, vocabulary, if you like, that might be associated with psychology. So, for example, you might expect the word memory to feature. Psychology students would know about memory. You might expect that psychology students might know about attachment theory, for example. And so he came up with a list of terms from these authors and then got the authors again to vote on which terms were the most important, and came out with a list of the top 100 terms and called it psychological literacy, by which he meant this is what all psychology graduates will know at the end of a degree. They will know about these 100 terms from psychology. Now, the problem with that is that psychology changes really quickly. And those top 100 terms definitely did not stay current. So, for example, within that list, the word neuropsychology never featured. And yet, I would imagine that you've learned quite a considerable amount of neuropsychology within your psychology degree. And so this list became outdated, and people started to think about, well, what do we mean by psychological literacy? Well, literacy as a term we tend to associate with written and spoken language, perhaps. But actually, more recently, literacy has become thought about in terms of how fluent we are in our use of a subject and our talking about a subject and the vocabulary of a subject, and how easily we can use the skills and knowledge that are associated with a particular subject. So, for example, you might have heard of the phrase, information technology literacy, IT literacy, or digital literacy, computer literacy, how easily you can use a computer to do the things you need to do. And Cranny and Dunn in 2011 started to apply that kind of idea of literacy being about how well and how familiar you are with the skills of a particular subject to psychology. And so they redefined psychological literacy, and they said that psychological literacy is about having that fluency, that facility, that ease of use in the evolving language, content, skills and applications associated with psychology. So take a moment. What do we mean by language and content? Possibly some of the subject topics that you've been thinking about. So, for example, the psychology of memory, the things that Bono might have talked about. But it's evolving, it's keeping that up to date. The skills and applications. What skills do you get from learning about psychology? What can you apply psychology to? And so that was where this idea of psychological literacy began to develop and evolve. And back in 2011, McGovern et al., also working with Cranny and Dunn, who were mentioned on the previous slide, came up with a set of 9 components that they said comprised psychological literacy. And these 9 components have been pretty much accepted, with some discussion and debate, as you might expect, ever since 2011. So they said that being psychologically literate means that we have a well-defined vocabulary and basic knowledge of the critical subject matter of psychology. Well, that's basically Bono's 100 words list, all in one little phrase, isn't it? So you, as a psychology almost graduate, will know lots of words to do with psychology. You will be able to use psychological language and terminology in talking about human behaviour, and you will have some knowledge, a basic knowledge at least, of most of the different key areas, the foundational knowledge of psychology. So, according to the British Psychological Society, which accredits your degree, you'll know biological psychology, you'll know cognitive psychology, you'll know social psychology, you'll know developmental psychology, you'll know research methods and statistics, you'll know something of the history and the contemporary issues in psychology. And those are the kind of core areas of psychology that someone might expect, based on the fact that you have a psychology degree, that you would have covered. The second component that McGovern et al. Talk about is valuing the intellectual challenges required to use scientific thinking and the disciplined analysis of information to evaluate alternative courses of action. Now, this is quite a detailed and complex component in a lot of ways. So you'll appreciate, according to McGovern et al., that sometimes things are intellectually difficult. It can be hard to get to grips with understanding human behaviour, what makes humans tick, that we need to use scientific thinking. We need to really analyse scientifically based on evidence, based on data, whether that's quantitative or qualitative data. We need to be able to analyse information to determine what's true, what's not true, perhaps, but also to make decisions about what actions we might take and to evaluate different choices. So, for example, you're approaching your graduation, you might want to make a decision about, should I stay on and do a postgraduate course, or should I go straight into the workplace? And according to McGovern et al., making those sorts of decisions and choosing what to do, you need to be able to draw on the science and the psychology and your ability to evaluate different choices. And psychology will help you to do that. Their third component is taking a creative and amiable skeptic approach to problem solving. I love this. The idea of being an amiable skeptic makes me chuckle and I really enjoy it. So amiable is friendly and skeptic means questioning everything. So it's a little bit like having your best friend saying to you, but why are you doing it that way? I'm not sure that's going to work. Are you sure that's the best decision? So being creative, being flexible, thinking in new ways and different ways and trying to use your psychology to question everything in a supportive and constructive way when you're making choices about how to solve problems. So I'm going to pick a problem at random. How do we close the educational inequality gaps within schools in Nottinghamshire so that children from disadvantaged backgrounds can get just as good an education as children from privileged backgrounds? How do we solve that problem? To solve that problem, we need to think creatively, we need to think in different ways, and we need to be questioning and constructive and forward thinking and solutions focused. And that will help us to solve our problems. My governor Tal say that because psychology makes you psychologically literate, it helps you to do these things, to solve problems. The fourth component is about applying psychology, applying psychological principles to personal, social and organisational issues in work, relationships and the broader community. So they're arguing here that if you're psychologically literate, if you have a psychology degree, then you can use psychology to make a difference, to use Bromwich and Horowitz's phrase, to your personal life, to your social life, and to different organisations, which might include your employer. And so these three domains, the personal, the social, and the organisational, might work in your employment, your work, in your relationships, your friendships, your family relationships, and in the broader community. So I talked about Nottinghamshire schools, for example. How could you use psychology to make your community a better place for everybody to live? The fifth component is about acting ethically. And acting ethically, you will have been learning about ethics in psychology through your research methods particularly, but it's not just about research methods. So it's not just about making sure you've got informed consent and that your participants can withdraw from your studies. It's also thinking about the limits of your expertise. So having a psychology degree, does that make you capable of being an expert witness in court about a psychological issue? Probably not. If you develop that expertise further, then yes, maybe. So thinking about ethics, not just in research, but generally throughout the different areas of life. Thinking about being, so the sixth one is being competent in using and evaluating information and technology. So this is about being able to find things out, maybe do a literature search, to then, when you've found lots of information, to separate the good from the bad, to know that if you've read a newspaper article, is that adequately representing the scientific background of something? So, for example, should we wear a mask to protect us from COVID? If you look at some of the popular media, you'll find conspiracy theories and masks don't work and all of that. If you look at the scientific literature, what does that tell us? How do you tell the difference between what's good advice and what's bad advice? What's scientifically evidence-based and what isn't? And so being able to make that information make sense to you and inform your decisions by finding it and learning about it and evaluating it. So that's where critical evaluation comes in. Being able to use technology, so being internet savvy at the very least, but maybe using, programming in R or, all those different ways of using technology. I've lost count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the seventh one is communicating effectively in different modes and with many different audiences. So it's all very well having all of this psychological knowledge and this scientific skill, but how do we talk to others about that. And if we're communicating with our family or our friends, we're using a different communication style than if we're writing a psychology lab report, or if, for example, we're writing to an employer to help them to see what we offer to them and why they might want to give us a job, or to an organisation that we're trying to work with to make recommendations, as you will in this module. How do we propose that you solve a problem that you have in your organisation? And the way that you talk to them will be different depending on whether or not they have a psychology background or not, for example. So being able to change the way that you communicate so that it makes sense to different audiences. If you're talking to a 3-year-old, you're not going to explain in the same way as if you're communicating to a 30-year-old. If you're communicating to a psychologist, you're not going to communicate in the same way as if you're communicating to a member of the general public. 8, recognising, understanding and fostering respect for diversity. And this to me is absolutely critical in terms of what psychology is all about. You've studied the psychology of individual differences, and you'll have thought about things like personality and intelligence, but you'll also have thought about how different factors influence individual development. So you'll have thought about how your education, your culture, your background, your ethnicity, your religion, your peer groups, your environment, the nutrition that you received, all of those things help to shape and form who we are. And recognizing that people are different, not just that that we know that they're different, but understanding what that means, understanding why we need to perhaps consider different forms of language, different forms of behaviour with different types of people. How do we demonstrate that we truly respect diversity in the world around us? And how are we inclusive? So a lot of my research, for example, is looking at how can we include disabled students within higher education. So how do we make sure that higher education is supportive of disabled students, for example? And then finally, our 9th component McGovern et al. Proposed was being insightful and reflective about one's own and others' behaviour and mental processes. So using our psychology to understand ourselves, to reflect on our own skills and abilities, our values, and also to understand how other people think and behave and what might inform that. And within this module, you'll be doing your reflective assignment. And I know Emma will have more to say about that fairly soon. But really being able to analyse yourself. So again, thinking about something that's very real and very human and very personal, but beginning to think about it in an evidence-based way that kind of steps back from yourself and looks at it academically. So being able to really kind of place your own thinking and behaviour into the context of the psychology that you're studying. Why did I do that? Why am I good at this? How does my cultural background change the way I think about particular issues, etc.? Okay, so I've presented a sort of definition of psychological literacy, but psychological literacy hasn't always been accepted completely uncritically. There is commentary and there is critique about it. So Robert et al. In 2015 wrote about the idea that these 9 components is quite complex, making sense of it is quite difficult. Murdoch in 2016 said, psychological literacy's got lots of good things in it, it's interesting, but it's under construction, it's still not a fully formed idea. Samantha Newell in 2021 said, well, yeah, great, but different people understand it in different ways and different people use the concept of psychological literacy in different ways. And then Harris et al. In 2021 said, great that psychology students have psychological literacy. Yeah, absolutely, but they don't know what it is. They've never heard the term. Is it actually a thing, or is it just a social construct that we've made up? Steve Newstead in 2015 wrote a really lovely article about psychological literacy and the emperor's new clothes, where he said that actually this is an aspirational concept. Is it really true that all students can do all of these things? They all respect diversity, they all act ethically, they can all creatively solve problems and all of these things. It's aspirational. Not every student is going to be able to do all this. It's not realistic. And kind of in response to that, really, some people have tried to measure psychological literacy and to say, well, can we find out how psychologically literate our students are? And the first attempts at this really were from Roberts et al. And Heritage et al. They're the same research group, it's just different author order. They created this really long questionnaire about psychological literacy. And I think, I mean, I'd encourage you to go and have a look at these papers. I think that they're probably not really looking at psychological literacy. So, for example, the vocabulary and basic knowledge of psychology is tested by using the myths about psychology scale. So, the idea is that if you're psychologically literate, you'll score lower on the myths questionnaire. And the myths questionnaire asks things like, do you really only use 10% of your brain? I think that's different than whether you really know about psychology, whether you really, just to be clear, we don't only use 10% of our brain, we use all of our brain. But I think that's different than being able to talk about how we remember things, how we learn things, how we develop language skills, etc. So I think they're different things. I'm not sure that the scales that they used were actually all that valid. And actually, myself and Jackie Cranny in 2021 wrote a chapter for the International Handbook of Psychology Education in which we said that all of this comes down to the fact that not all students will develop all aspects of psychological literacy, but we hope that all of you will have the opportunity to learn about all of these aspects. And perhaps some of you will do really well on developing ethics or problem solving skills, and others of you will be really good at finding and evaluating information, and others of you will be really, really good at using the knowledge and terminology of psychology. So we talked about the idea of having a spiky profile. And so on the left here, student A might be scoring really high on the first skill. They get a score of 100, whereas the second student on the right here is scoring 75-ish. So, but you don't get the same score on all of the different skills. In other words, you can be good at one thing and not so good at another thing. And you have to meet a basic threshold, but you don't have to be perfect at everything. And you know, that's probably true if you think about things like how good you are at stats compared to how good you are at qualitative analysis. Some people will be really good at stats and some people will be really good at qualitative analysis, but you might not be really good at both. You might be. The other criticism of psychological literacy is that McGovern et al.'s 9 components are sometimes associated with psychology and sometimes not. So maybe some of these are just generic skills that every graduate gets. And so there's been different ways of trying to separate this out. How much of this is to do with psychology and how much of this is to do with just going to university and getting a degree. So Roberts et al., when they tried to measure psychological literacy, carried out a factor analysis to work out how these different components of psychology might group together. And they suggested that there were some generic graduate attributes, that there were some attributes associated with psychology as a helping profession, and that there were some psychological literacy components that related to reflection. Now, I've put there the way that they grouped these items based on the statistical factor analysis that they used into the boxes here, and you can see how they associate. So I'm quite interested that they think this generic graduate attributes list includes things like communicating in different modes and with many different audiences. So they say that every degree will give you communication skills. They say that every degree will make you competent in using and evaluating information and technology. But they also say that you'll have a well-defined vocabulary and basic knowledge of the critical subject matter of psychology. And that, they say, is a generic graduate attribute. So if you study a degree in law or history or business or physics or archaeology, whatever degree you study, you'll have this knowledge of psychology. And I'm not convinced by that. They also picked up on this idea of psychology as a helping profession. So being able to apply psychology to personal, social and organisational issues in work relationships in the broader community. They say that's about psychology in helping other people. And then they say that the reflective processes are this last one, being insightful and reflective about one's own and others' behaviour and mental processes. Unrelated, so statistically not correlated with any of the other components, was this idea of recognising and fostering respect for diversity, recognising, understanding and fostering respect for diversity. So that doesn't fit into their factor structure. So that was how Roberts et al. Explained it. And as I say, I think there's some problems there because of the way that their scale worked. I like the fact that they tried to measure psychological literacy. I'm not convinced they quite got it right. And to be fair, they're not convinced they got it right either anymore. So I tried to do it, not statistically, this is just my thinking about it. Maybe you'd like to have a go and see what you think. And I grouped it into generic, which can be acquired through the study of most subjects. And I just did this by surface validity. I made a group that was psychology related but might come from other subjects, and a group that were distinctive to psychology. So in the first group that's generic, I thought, yeah, pretty much any graduate can find information and evaluate it and use technology. Most subjects have something about communicating in different modes and to different audiences. I will accept that as that's a generic graduate skill. In terms of psychology related, but can be gained from some other subjects. For example, acting ethically. Now in psychology, we spend quite a bit of time teaching you about ethics and ethical behaviour and what ethics means. So I would expect that you'd be good at acting ethically. But I would also suggest that law students do a lot on ethics, and nursing students do a lot on ethics, and medical students and social work students, and probably business and marketing students, and all sorts of other people will do things around ethical behaviour. And so, yes, we study it in psychology. It is psychology related, but it also comes from some other subjects. And then the distinctive to psychology, I think, are the things that you can only learn in psychology that are very much about the subject of psychology. So learning about the vocabulary and the basic knowledge of psychology as a subject, to me, has to be distinctive to psychology, in contrast to Roberts et al., who said that it was a generic graduate attribute. Have a look, have a think for yourself. Where would you put each of these skills and attributes? How would you group these? given all the controversy, it's quite nice sometimes to have a nice, simple overview definition. So here, in a nutshell, is what everybody agrees. And there's really no argument about psychological literacy is about. So if you study psychology, if you become fluent in psychology and you can use psychology with ease, then this is what Jackie Cranny et al. Say psychological literacy is. It's the general capacity to adaptively and intentionally apply psychology to meet personal, professional, and societal needs. So Cranny et al. Are suggesting that you have the ability, the capacity to adaptively apply psychology. This means you can apply it in different ways in different contexts. You can be flexible in the way that you think about and use psychology in your everyday life. That you intend to apply psychology, you can choose to apply psychology. So when you're faced with a decision or a puzzle or a problem, you can actually stop and think, oh, I've got psychology. I can use that to help me solve this problem. Applying psychology, taking those theories, taking them out of the abstract and using them, making them useful to meet personal, professional and societal needs. Now, your personal needs might be, for example, thinking about your own health and well-being, looking after your own mental health. It might be about supporting your family, so working with those immediately around you, choosing your relationships and your friendships. It might be about how to make yourself a better learner, for example. How can you use psychology to improve your learning skills and your learning abilities? So those are your personal life. Your professional life is your employability, thinking about how do you present yourself to an employer to encourage them to give you a job? Thinking about your communication skills within the workplace, thinking about how you might build good and effective teams within the workplace, how you lead. What's the psychology of leadership all about? How can you bring that into your work life? And I think, how do you create work-life balance so that the professional and the personal kind of interlink? And then societal needs. Here you might be thinking about, how do we reduce antisocial behaviour in a particular neighbourhood? How do we support young people who are experiencing mental ill health following the COVID pandemic? You might think about, how do we save the planet in the context of climate change? All of those things. And so psychology becomes like a toolkit. You choose the part of psychology that makes sense to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. And you can apply it in all areas of your life. Now, in 2015, I suggested that this personal, professional and societal needs was a little bit like a ripple effect. If you drop the pebble of yourself into a pond, and then your knowledge of psychology and your ability to apply psychology ripples out, and you can use that psychology to help yourself, your family, your employment, your community immediately around you. So it might be other students at NTU at the moment. It might be your neighbourhood. It might be, for example, if you are a member of the LGBTQ plus community, how do you support people within that community? And then globally, thinking about, how do we save the planet? How are we good global citizens in a world in which national borders don't make a lot of difference to things like virus transmission, water pollution? They all cross national borders. So how do we operate within this global community? So I've listed there some of the areas that you might think about for your personal life, and we've talked a little bit about mental health and well-being, self-awareness, understanding yourself, being reflective, accessibility, helping to make information that you share accessible to those from different cultural backgrounds, those who are disabled, etc. Thinking about inclusion, thinking about how we support everybody to feel included and a sense of belonging. Professional, thinking about employability, entrepreneurship, knowing about how you can use psychology to become a psychologist, but also what sorts of career pathways could you follow outside of psychology. So, for example, working in the charity sector or wherever you want to work, using psychology to gain and benefit from work experience, to engage employers. And then societal psychology, thinking about things like community psychology, a whole research area in itself, thinking about how we can decolonize information and the scientific process. How can we be inclusive to those from different cultural groups and make sure that we recognize fully and appreciate that diversity and those different perspectives within the work that we do. Thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, so how can we fight poverty and hunger and slave labour and look after our watercourses, and where does psychology fit into all that? And how can we use psychology to battle structural inequalities? So the fact that people from poorer backgrounds, for example, tend to have less positive health outcomes. How can psychology help us with that? Boyer in 1990 asked the question of what is higher education or university education for? And this is a quote from him, and I find it really exciting. Why do you go to university? Well, the aim of education is not only to prepare students for productive careers, and we talk a lot about employability, but it's also to enable them to live lives of dignity and purpose, not only to generate new knowledge, research, for example, but to help shape a citizenry that can promote the public good. We can make a difference to the rest of humanity. Thus, higher education's vision must be widened if the nation, any nation I would argue, is to be rescued from the problems that threaten to diminish permanently the quality of life. We need to think about higher education as something that prepares us as students, as academics, all of us together to make a difference in the world around us. And Diane Halpern, when she first started writing about psychological literacy back in 2010, wrote that today's students must prepare themselves for a world in which knowledge is accumulating at a rapidly accelerating rate, and in which old problems such as poverty, racism, and pollution join new problems such as global terrorism, not so new now, 13 years after she wrote this. All of these problems require psychological knowledge, skills, and values for their solution. And this is what became known as psychologically literate citizenship. The idea that psychologically literate citizens are critical scientific thinkers and ethical and socially responsible participants in their communities. It's picking up on this idea from Boyer that we are able to evaluate information, to think about different courses of action based on the education that we've received. We can bring our psychology, which gives us a unique perspective into human behaviour, and we can apply that psychologically literately, not sure if that's a phrase, but there you go, to actually make us better citizens in the world. So our understanding of people goes alongside these generic graduate skills that we get. Right back to that first quote that I gave you from Human Kitching about psychology being about what it is to be human and being able to think about that in a rational, scientific way, as well as to experience it subjectively. Over recent years, Diane Halpern in the US was the first person to write about psychological literacy. So she wrote a book about psychology, the blueprint of the discipline. What should psychology be like going forward? Annie Trapp and a group of us really produced this Future of Undergraduate Psychology in the UK report back in 2011. If you dig about in there, you'll find a photo of a very young me. In 2013, I was involved in writing for Advanced HE, which is an organisation that supports universities in the UK, and I was writing about psychological literacy. You can see a picture of one of the guides that I wrote there. In 2016, the Quality Assurance Agency picked up on this information. Now, they're the people who say across the whole of the UK what a degree should look like, what standards it should meet. And in 2016, I was part of the group that wrote the subject benchmark for psychology, and we made the case there that all psychology degrees should teach students to be psychologically literate. The BPS, the British Psychological Society, who then who accredit your degree, then also introduced psychological literacy into their accreditation standards for the first time in 2016. In 2021, Harris et al. Said, well, students don't know the language, but when we talk to students about what do they want to get out of their psychology degree, they want to develop these attributes. They want to be critical thinkers, they want to be scientific thinkers, they want to be ethical, they want to be able to communicate, they want to be able to respect diversity. All of these things are important to students, and they value these concepts. And this year, the new QAA subject benchmark, so the new standards for what psychology degrees all across the UK should look like, is coming out very, very soon. And it has a really strong emphasis on psychological literacy. And it's really promoting the idea of psychology as a discipline, as a subject that helps us to be inclusive of others, to respect diversity, to promote sustainability, and to really look after our planet, and to be employable and entrepreneurial in the way that we work if we have a psychology degree. So I just wanted to present this one slide to say, this is why it's important. It's important for you as an individual, but it's increasingly being recognised that the government thinks that psychology is important for these skills and these abilities. So I leave you with a question. What are you going to use your psychology degree for? What difference do you want to make? I think psychology provides you with a fantastic toolkit to make a difference in all areas of life and in so many different ways on our planet. Really, what you do with your psychology degree is up to you. But I leave you with this quote from Jane Goodall. You cannot get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and as I say, you'll find lots of reading on the Now Room that you can go and have a look at. Some of it's quite simple and short, some of it's a bit more complex, but I will leave you to have a look at that and see what you find interesting. You'll also find, where possible, a lot of the links on the slides will take you to the original papers that I've talked about in this lecture. So do go and have a look at some of those if you wish to. Thank you very much, and I will see you soon. Bye.